So writing reviews then, how can you approach it and how can it help you to write papers? I will start actually by telling a little bit about my own story. I started my research in mathematics, so my PhD is in abstract algebra and number theory. So it took me actually quite a while until I started to write papers in my current field. So I wrote a few in mathematics, and I actually started reviewing before I wrote maybe I wrote some paper before, but I didn't write a lot of papers in the beginning. But then after a while, I started to do more and more research of my own. So after my PhD, I started at something called the National Center for Mathematics Education. And this is not really a research institution, primarily, at least. So we do developmental work for teachers and professional development and that sort of things. So I still work there, but I will actually start as a professor in mathematics education at another institution in a few days here. But most of my work has been revolving around professional development and teaching design. So I kind of call myself a teaching designer sometimes, and some research also. So that's kind of my story. And during these years when I didn't write so much, and up until now, I was also co-advisor for some students. So that was also kind of an unusual story because I was not very experienced in writing myself at that point. But I did review quite a lot. So this is from a website that's called Scopus, which is really interesting. It indexes some journals, not all journals I review for, but some of them, and they can keep track of your reviews, so you can get some data. And I think if you review for some of these papers, you should join Scopus because it's quite interesting, and I think it's very rewarding to review, and I think it's very important for the field to review, that there are people that are willing to review, despite that it takes a lot of time. But you're not rewarded formally like when you are writing articles, because when you submit proposals for some research grant and so on, you don't get as much credit for reviewing. But I learned a lot over the years from reviewing, and I will come back to this. So this is kind of my data then. You see, I did some reviews for these particular papers over the years, so actually you can see some other interesting things there. I kind of reviewed for these papers, at least, the ones that are indexed by Scopus. I reviewed 4.4 papers for every paper I wrote, and I did like 61 reviews. I think in total I might have made maybe 120 reviews or something, if you count both the journal articles and conference papers and so on. So it's if you would count the time I spent on it, it's quite a lot. And I do actually spend a lot of time on every paper I review. It's a little bit different depending on the context, but you see that my reviews are almost 1,200 words long, and that's quite a lot of longer. It's a little bit more than double the typical review in mathematics education. This is also data from Scopus, so this is the kind of things you can find there. So it's quite interesting. So it's just a background. So what to look for when reviewing? This is not really, in some sense, you have the choice to decide this yourself a little bit, because you're reviewing because you are a researcher and you're a peer reviewer, let's say. But there's also a matter of different journals. They can have different objectives and so on. So let's look at a few of them. So one of the journals I'm reviewing most for is the Scandinavian Journal of Educational Research. So here are there like principles. So you are asked more or less to answer these questions. We don't need to read them all, but we can read some of them. Does the introduction part of the article include an up-to-date review about previous research? So they start from the beginning here. You're supposed to look at the introduction. Does the introduction part of the article include a well-argumented justification? So is there a kind of argument for the novelty of it, and so on? And then it goes on there with some kind of standard questions. And one way of reviewing would pretty much be to just answer these questions. You go through the paper and then you answer these questions and then you make your decision, let's say. Let's look at another one. So this is educational studies. So it's kind of similar, but it's a bit of a different structure. So first it starts more specific. Is this article clearly an educational study in mathematics? It's quite interesting. It was nothing like that in the other one. So here we must decide if this is about mathematics education or not. Is it a clear contribution, and so on. And then it separates this quality issue from the presentation issue, and then there are some questions about how to advise the editor from this. So it's a different structure. So, and also here you could just follow this structure if you want. And this is for a conference. It's kind of similar to the YERME conference, I say. So this is a much simpler one. So you're still supposed to answer a few questions. Is there a clear statement of the problem? Is the literature review or theoretical framework good? And so on. You say yes or no, or you give some comments here. And then you give some ideas about this. Should there be some revisions on this? I think if you reviewed, you probably saw all this and so on. So I think we can already here start with a short discussion if somebody has something they want to say. Because from my point of view, these different journals and conferences, they are trying maybe to get slightly different reviews. So a question then would be, as authors or whatever you consider yourself to be, do you expect reviews to be different depending on where you submit your paper, if it's a conference paper or if a different kind of journals, or would you prefer some particular kind of format? Do you think the reviewers should follow this, or do you expect them to do something different? So let's see if anybody has a comment on that. So then we take this one of these discussion breaks. Quite early on, I developed my own, or actually I copied it from somebody. It was actually on a seminar like this that was held by Mogens Nis a long time ago. I picked up a structure, then I modified it, and I actually keep to the same structure almost always. And for me, so in the end, I might fill in those questions from the journal, but then that's after I sort of did my work, and I always deliver or almost always deliver a review that follows a particular structure that I like. And that, for me, it makes it a bit easier actually, because then I can always follow this idea as a reviewer. And I might be different. It might be different depending on what it is. I mean, we didn't even talk about like book chapters and invited stuff and so on. Then you might do it a little bit differently, but I still follow this general structure. And it is like this. So I have 4 sections in my reviews. So it's nothing strange about it, but I will show for each of these how I develop what to put in and what is in them, and I will show some examples from some reviews I did. So I start with the recommendations to the editor. So that is kind of a brief summary where the clearest points are extracted from the rest of it. And this usually has then, if I think it should be rejected or whatever it is, and so on. But the main reason for it, so the reviewer can actually read this and see my main reason right away. So this, because I'm writing mostly for the reviewer in a sense. And then I also make my own abstract, let's say. I read the paper and then I make my own summary. And usually it's very different from the abstract that's put in there, because I want to actually describe the paper. That's also kind of a service to myself and to the reviewer, and perhaps to the author also. And this has taught me a lot about abstract actually, because many abstracts are really bad because they don't really say what's in the paper. They are more like an advertisement for the paper. So I think we could actually learn to write our abstracts much better. So and when you, for example, do research reviews or overviews or systematic reviews and so on, and you have to read maybe 1,000 abstracts, then it's quite good if the abstracts are good. Then you become quite pissed off actually when you can't read the abstracts and understand what the paper is about. So this is something I do. I don't start with it. I write it. I will show later when I do this. And then I write some general comments, usually a short little description and A, B, C, D, a few. That's my main criticism or points about the article. So that's the core of the review, let's say. And in them, I usually also exemplify them by on which page you can see an example of what I'm trying to convey. So the review ends with a long list of comments that some of these are examples that connect to these ABC comments and so on, and some are just spelling errors and general things that are very minor things. But so this is my structure then that I use, and I will exemplify how I do it, how it looks. But the process then. So this might, of course, be done very, very differently as well as the structure. But I start on the same day when I agree to a review. I read the paper, perhaps very quickly, but I always read it the first day. And then I deliver it the last day. So I use the full time that I have. I try to not be late, but I try to deliver it the last day. It's very seldom I do it before. So then I might make some small notes or some mental notes. I make a first, try to understand what is this. And usually you get an idea if this is a good or a bad paper already. But this idea is often wrong. So you must at some point be able to revise your idea and change your mind. And this can go both ways. So then I read it again, and then with more care, and this might be a little bit later than maybe a few weeks later or something, depending on when I have the time to really attack this. So I read later, I try to pick up the major issues and understand the paper, and I try to look at the structure and look at it more formally and so on. But it's more really still a read through than looking at the particular aspects of it. I actually don't do that so much. So I more view it as a totality in a sense. And when I find these issues, I try to make a note and explain how is the issue actually manifested. So what is an example of this issue? Sometimes this is difficult, but if, for example, some stuff that is in the first parts of the paper, the introduction or theory or background or some, are not used later, then I might, remark this thing. You write a lot about this thing, but you never pick up on it later, and that sort of things. And here's an example. And then after that, I pretty much have the idea of what I'm going to write about this paper. But then at some point when it starts to get closer to deliver this, I read it very carefully again. And I make many page-by-page remarks, usually, not always, because if it's a paper that's quite far from publication, I might not pay that kind of attention to it. But in particular, this is when I decide if my comments were correct. And it happens that I have to change my mind. So maybe my remarks were still correct, but in some sense, first I maybe thought that this is kind of an irreparable thing and it has to be a big revision. And then I might end up saying, well, actually it could be fixed in this and this way. Or it could be the reverse also. And then I write the summary. So this is the point when I write the summary. So now I kind of know the paper enough to be able to summarize this. And then I write a review. So this is usually done the last day. But then I have a lot of notes, so it's more like structuring the notes and so on. So this is how I do it. So now I want to show some examples from these, if you like. I mean, this is all my personal thing, and this is the thing with reviewing. You don't discuss it so often usually. So, but this is from an article I reviewed for what ended up being one of my colleagues, but I didn't know that at the time. So here, let's read it, or you can read it yourself. Let's take a few seconds. So what I did here, I mean, this is kind of a special one, because in this case, I thought this was a publishable paper, or could become a publishable paper, but I didn't think it fitted the journal very well. So I thought it would take too much, at least at that point, and this journal at that point didn't publish a whole lot of mathematics. Now they do, so now I might have thought differently about this particular issue, but I recommended it sending it to another journal simply. And that can happen sometimes. That can also be like a quality thing. If you're reviewing for like educational studies and so on, you might think that, well, it's kind of good, but maybe not educational studies good. So then you might be a little tougher on that thing. But otherwise, I describe some good things about the paper. So I try to always do it, because in the end, it will be mostly criticism. But I also pinpoint what I thought was the issues here with the framework, for example, and so on. So maybe not so interesting, but let's take this one. So it's also comments to the editor. So I can read this one myself. This paper has some interesting merits to it. There is not a whole lot of quantitative research on preschool teachers in Norway, as this happened to be about, and their views on mathematics has not been examined. So this, for me to be able to write this, I must trust first the ones that wrote the paper, that they represented the background, the previous research more or less correctly, or I must know it myself, because sometimes they don't. So this is hard, but in this case, I thought that, well, this is actually a novel type of research. So there was pretty interesting results, and I recommended publication after some issues had been fixed. So this is relatively typical how you can. So I had 5 issues and so on. In particular one then. So but you see here already in these comments, I indicate where can you find more information? Where can the editor, if he wants it, find the information about why I say this? Well, in A, B, and C, and it has this connection to each other. Here's another one also. This is a revision of an article I reviewed before, and then it can be quite different. I don't remember if it's the same. I think it's actually the same article, the next revision of the same article. As mentioned in my earlier review, I think this is a well-constructed article about a worthwhile subject. So this is a praise. It has improved. This is good. I have no major remarks, but I have collected some minor ones. And then I leave it to the editor to decide if this needs to go on another review round or not. I said, well, this can be fixed by the author and you can have a look, more or less. But actually, with this particular journal, they always send it out once more. So this irritates me a little bit. I have had papers that almost don't have any issues, and for the author, it will take another 3 months. So we are super slow at publishing in our field. And I will get back to this later, what we could do about it, perhaps. Or I can say it already. I published in some non-mathematics education journal, and then there was one review round, or perhaps 2, and then they set up like almost like a chat system. So the reviewers could post their questions to the author, and we had 1 day to answer the questions. And then we could have a little bit of a discussion there, and then it was published. So this was a really quick way to resolve some issues. I think that would be like a great innovation, actually, because we are so slow. So another one. So this is a reject, a clean reject. So why is it rejected? It's novelty. the paper does not explain what kind of knowledge gap the study was designed to fill. So I didn't see the novelty, and they didn't even try good enough to explain the novelty. And it happens that I let some papers that are not very novel pass because they are interesting in some other way. But usually you need to actually explain what a novelty is, and it's quite often it's not done very well, not in a convincing way. So then it just explains why this is not novel, or what other merits the paper might still have, and so on. I think this is the last one of the editor comments. So what is the issue here then? I say that while the author argues convincingly why the issue that is research, reading strategies are important, and maybe of particular importance for students in Sweden. So this was Swedish research also. There are still some issues. Let's see what it was then. In this case, it was not a good enough discussion of how the data was analyzed. And this is one of the most things I am most often critical to in qualitative research in mathematics education. So you maybe analyze some textbook or some interviews or something, and you give some examples and you put out some results, but you don't explain why was these particular results, how did they actually come from the data, because you can't show all the data. That's a problem. You must have a really clear description of it, but this didn't. So, and this is then an example of my general type of comments that I make. So this is not for the editor. Usually I write to the editor that he may share the results that I write to the editor with the author. So it's very seldom I write something that I don't think the author could read. So I leave that up to the editor and I write it in one big choke, let's say. But I have heard from editors that don't like the recommendation, the actual recommendation from the reviewers to be public to the authors. So this is a different opinions around this, because then the author can say, well, I had two good ones, two accept and one reject, so why did you reject me? But maybe the rejection was so strong so that it actually was a reject. So it's not like a voting system really. So then if the editor don't need to show this to the author, then he can more easily argue for his decisions sometimes. Okay, so this is the comments that I then leave to the authors. So this is kind of typical, that I try to be a little bit nice. It's good about the importance of textbooks, and so this is actually the first. It's the same that I showed the first, but the comments to the author. Let's see. I have some concerns. So this is not actually a very clear one. I end up by saying that I have some concerns that I think need to be attended to before the paper is suitable. But remember, to the editor, I said that this should be actually in another journal. So, but then the editor can decide if it should be sort of rejected and recommended for some other journal or fixed, because I thought it could be fixed. So to the author, I don't focus on this issue. I focus on what could be fixed or not. And I give some more comments about that. So like this. So this what follows now will be the sort of general comments that follows in the same. It's the same paper. So then I make a quite long comment, let's say, about how this author used the framework. And actually, I was not so satisfied. And why wasn't I? Well, I went into the framework and looked at it. So I spent the time to look up what this author did, because I was not enough convinced that this was used in a good way, let's say. Or it was good, but it could be better. So then I tried to spend that little time and try to check up if it's, sometimes the framework in its original publication is not good either. I mean, there might be issues already there. And then as a reviewer, you are in a difficult position, because if somebody uses somebody else's already published, but kind of not, maybe not good in my view, framework, should I criticize that or not? And it's a kind of a hard question. But here I suggested some improvements, let's say. And also that the author should actually present this framework a little bit more clear, because you didn't understand. That was in the beginning why I had to go to the original research and look it up. So when you as authors use somebody else's work, it pays off to be very clear about it, and maybe sometimes spend a little bit of space to explain it clearly. The next comment, it's for the same paper. This is another issue, because here the author used a term or a concept, is potential, the learning potential or teaching potential of the textbooks. And this is not as easily to find the origins of, so you don't know if the author invented this herself or not. And I was not so happy with the whole idea of this potential. So here I spent some time to explain why I thought this concept should be removed from the paper, more or less. So, and then I try to, in the end, so this this means here. This means it's easy to argue why also a more direct focus on content analysis would be important. So leaving out the potentiality from the actual research question would, as I see it, help clear up the paper. And the Shield and Doyle framework will, as far as I can understand, just work as well or better without the concept of potentiality. So I'm not asking the researcher to do a different kind of research. I'm just helping to clear up a little issue that I think is made the paper fuzzy. So it's a different kind of advice then. So as readers, what should you learn from this? Well, don't use fuzzy concepts. This is another type of comment then. It's also from the same. So there's also a term or a concept, the term structure. It's used a lot in this paper, I say. But it's used in several different ways, and usually it's just a buzzword. And then I again went to the original framework and checked up how they used it, but they also used it in several different ways. So then I'm in this position that, well, should I, I'm maybe not in a position to correct Shield and Dole's already published paper from many years ago, but I still recommended to clear up the use in this paper of how structure is used. And it actually referred to several other researchers and their use of structure. So there was a repair that's possible to do then. And this, I think, is the last one then. This is a presentational issue, so it's a different style of issue. And this is typical that the same thing I took up before, because this was a qualitative analysis, and the result and analysis was kind of presented in one chunk, which is quite common, but it was only one example for each category, and there was no real explanation, let's say more abstract explanation of how these categories were defined and why these particular examples were actually examples of these categories. And this is a difficult thing when you're writing these sorts of papers, because you only have a certain amount of space. And if you could give 10 examples for every category, it would kind of be explanatory enough, but you can't. So I simply, let's say, what was my recommendation. I end with, for a particular category, was it enough with one good? Okay, I ask about her, the author's rationale for actually choosing these examples. So I wanted a more methodological explanation of how the categories were defined in this case. So you see, this was just one paper, and I thought it was, I mean, there's a lot of issues, and I thought it could actually be, all of this could have been fixed. But I also recommended another paper, another journal, but that was not the main thing. So I think this review is quite typical of my reviews. So often when you get the first paper, it's not very often it's, let's say, much better than this. So usually you find these sort of issues in almost every paper. But then you can see, but if you do this, if you do this, if you do this, it would be repairable. Because in the background here, I sense this is still good research. There's nothing, it's interesting. It's a relatively novel issue. You know, I believe this is true, what was in the paper. It was not just, you know, written up well enough. And this is kind of how my comment page by page look. We don't need to read them, but I just take the page and the line and write some stuff. So typically it could be that some phrase, I don't think that some phrase is clear enough. So just clear it up and maybe I offer a suggestion and so on. So just not very deep stuff. So let's go then to a discussion again, and then I will kind of end with some dilemmas and some recommendations, let's say, that I have. So some things that happened to me are quite difficult. For example, a few times I have had really good research that I review. I mean, it's very clear everything, but I know this is wrong. I mean, it's wrong in the sense that there is some teaching method recommended or something in it that I see that, well, this this is actually the wrong way to go. So because of my, and that's quite hard because the research is kind of correct, but I know that this is bad in some other way. So that's kind of a difficult dilemma, and I have let some papers like this through that it goes kind of against everything I believe in, because I thought I was like expected to just do the review the research quality. But I think I will be more careful with that, you know, in the future. But it's a difficult issue. There's no resolution of it. And the other thing I just want to say that you should never do, you should never ask the author for a completely different paper. I mean, to research something that they didn't. So I give a lot of comments and so on, but also when some review my papers and say you should have done this research instead, more or less, I think that's kind of bad practice for a reviewer. You should review what's on the table and give advice how it can be improved, but not, you know, do some other research instead. And sometimes you slip a little on this, but this is just a recommendation. And then there's this issue which is quite, well, you know, maybe close to my way of reviewing. Should you act like an advisor or co-author almost? And I think I do sometimes. I take this quite far. We'll try to, you know, help. I don't know, maybe my reviews become too long sometimes because of that, but it's just a decision I took at some point that this is how I'm gonna do it. But maybe sometimes shorter stuff and more clear with just identifying the issues, and then the author can deal with them as they want. I think you should be as polite as you can because it's, you know how it is to get the reviews, you know. And it's going to be a lot of criticism. So you should always try to find some nice things and tell about them also, and then be polite and not rude, but also as sharp as you can, because it's better if the issues are told. You know, you must tell them clearly. Otherwise, it's very hard to understand as an author what's about, and also for the editor. And but also pinpoint the stuff that actually can be fixed. And if you have an idea, then, you know, at least I choose then to try to explain how it could be fixed. If you do this and this, and this is not the same as asking an author to write another paper, because it's just fixing the issues. And then I don't say that, well, you must do this. It's a suggestion to fix the issue that I think must be fixed. And then, as Tim said, this is kind of also, this is how I started reviewing. I only had two questions. Is this interesting? Is it true? And then I kind of, if it's interesting and I believe that this is actually true, then this will, then maybe with revisions, it will always be, you know, something I thought in the end should be published, because I make kind of an idea about the paper. Will this be published in the end or not? If I don't think it can be fixed, then it should be rejected, or maybe some bigger thing. And then also, oh, here's a spelling issue. If you are like fresh reviewers, usually you will review for maybe worse journals and conferences, and then we will probably be reviewing worse papers, and that's quite hard. It's harder to review worse papers than really good ones. But you have to. But these need reviewing too, and these authors also need good comments, and it takes a lot of effort and time. It's just how it is. And it's but you learn a lot, and also this checking up references and gives you an overview of the feed, even if it takes time. So it's like education for yourself to do this. And the more papers you get to read in this very careful way, the better you can develop your style. So you see many different styles, and you should accept many different styles also. I think we are sometimes too firm on the style. So you can develop a lot by just reviewing simply. So this is kind of my finish. So now we just have 2 minutes, but still maybe some comments at least.